After that elaborate presentation, Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Professor Schumer, Vice Rector Professor Zala, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor for me to be here this morning to deliver the keynote lecture for this conference. And my topic is on creating and enhancing capacity in Africa for efficient economic and social development. My lecture is divided into about 5 parts, with issues on capacity, issues on monitoring, also begin with a general overview, and also the prospects for Africa. Africa is the second largest and second most populated continent in the world, with an estimated population of 1.2 billion. It also has the most youthful and fastest growing population globally. More than 40% of Africans are under the age of 15, and 20% are between the ages of 15 and 24. We estimate that by the year 2050, 1/3 of the world's population will live in Africa, up from about 1/5 in 2012. Such growth will be imbalanced across Africa, with southern and North African countries characterized by slowing or even negative youth population growth, while West, Central, and East African countries will experience significant youth population increases. Sub-Saharan Africa will have a considerably higher youth-to-population ratio over the next 35 years. The continent must therefore be ready for an increasingly young labor force. Africa is also currently just at the beginning of what we call a demographic transition. Advances in healthcare and well-being have led to increased life expectancy and improvements in infant and child mortality rates. Fertility rates are also projected to fall as socio-economic well-being increases, but following a time lag. The result is an interim period of rapid population growth, which we now characterize as the youth bulge. While there are considerable variations across the continent, Africa will continue to have a young workforce for this century. A good understanding of how young job seekers engage with labor markets is therefore quite crucial at this time. The youth bulge may be concentrated in West Central and East Africa, but young people in North Africa and Southern Africa continue to face high levels of low-wage temporary jobs that compound their poverty and sense of inequality. The rates of unemployment are higher in urban areas than in rural areas, although they can also generate faster economic growth. Youth migration has contributed to the urban crisis. Opportunities are quite low for rural youth. Therefore, increasing opportunities for rural youth can help curb the urban crisis. Despite the relatively rapid economic growth, inadequate job creation for the youth bulge of Africans with few skills relevant to the labor market, and an underperforming educational system has failed to prepare young people for existing jobs. There is also a significant gender discrepancy emerging as young women tend to marry early and withdraw from the labor force and focus on rearing a family. Africa's widespread youth unemployment threatens to undermine social and political stability and means that young people are particularly vulnerable to radicalization. Now, what are the recent developments in Africa that are spanning from this economic growth? Africa's current economic growth is generating interest among global investors and is changing old-age perceptions of the continent as stagnant, high-risk, and weak. Sub-Saharan Africa economies are expected to post an average growth rate of close to 6% in the next decade, exceeding the projected average of any other world region. Today, we witness the highest flows of capital into the African continent. There has been a rise of foreign direct investment from $10 billion in 2000 to nearly $80 billion in 2010. And at the moment, The United Nations tells us that this should by now have increased to over $150 billion. Africa has benefited from steady flows of commodity-driven growth in the past. However, all indications are that the continent's current economic expansion is qualitatively different from the growing emissions of the past. Some of the most critical constituents of this growth have been high commodity prices, which have been propelled by enduring high demand from China and other emerging markets, as well as new sources of energy and mining production. The paradox here is that several African countries remain heavily reliant on the revenues from unprocessed commodities. What is also important here is that the African continent's recent surge has been sectors outside of extractive industries. These include construction, transportation, telecommunications, and wholesale and retail, as well as financial services. Finally, Africa's consumer base, propelled by rapid urbanization and rising incomes, is expanding rapidly, with consumer spending projected to grow from $860 million in 2000 to $1.4 trillion by the year 2020. That's in about 2 years from now. Not all countries have been pulled along by Africa's rise, and several impoverished, landlocked, and poorly governed countries will likely remain fragile and stagnant. Nonetheless, the decisive issue here is that many African governments are rising to the challenge, and an increasing number are beginning to struggle more systematically with long-standing impediments to growth. Across these challenges, there are new opportunities and examples of positive progress that suggest that how corporate and public actors can collaborate to overcome barriers to investment and structural transformation. Moreover, in partnership with private investors, governments are more actively asking to redress the linkages between the investment, growth, local employment, skills transfer, and value addition. Now, what are the challenges to all this? There are complex challenges that African governments need to address successfully. African governments must overtly prove a strategic vision for growth and social development, as well as collaborative partnerships and long-term commitment. If Africa fails to challenge these impediments, this will leave African economies unprepared to capitalize on the critical opportunities that will arise in the coming decades for industrial growth, diversification, and fuller integration into global supply chains. The enormous challenge of generating employment for the continent's growing youth population makes this task even more urgent. An estimated 12 million young Africans will join the labor pool every year over the next decade. Without vastly expanded opportunities in agriculture and manufacturing, governments will face increasing and possibly destabilizing pressures from a frustrated and underemployed citizenry. African governments must therefore ensure the equitable distribution of the benefits of growth and transformation. They must also ensure that these translate to improved well-being of citizens, including the most vulnerable. For this to materialize successfully, governments will need to enforce regulations and other enforcement capacities to ensure that private sector players adhere to acceptable standards in labor practices, environmental stewardship, integrity, and transparency. African governments will also need to have sound revenue collection and management systems to support public investments that may not be commercially bankable, but that serve vulnerable populations for the broader public good. Moreover, and most important, it will require accountable, transparent governance and a culture of open service among political leaders and influential domestic constituencies to hold institutions and investors to account. For all the optimism around Africa's rise, these broader objectives will ultimately be the measure of success. The World Bank has estimated that Africa has more than 200 million people between the ages of 14 and 24, which makes it the world's youngest continent. The figure should double by 2045. There is considerable apprehension about what this demographic youth bulge may mean for political stability and development if economic opportunities are not available. This possibility should spur African leaders to tackle the obstacles to structural economic transformation that includes power generation, infrastructural development, regional integration, with far greater urgency, I would say. But leaders should also look to Africa's youth cohort as a potential engine of growth and development, innovation, and entrepreneurship, particularly as workforces in other parts of the world, China and Europe, for example, are aging at the moment. What are the opportunities we have for African economies? Many African economies are at a turning point with no limits to available opportunities for sustained growth, structural change, and accelerated development. Each African country is facing its unique set of economic, political, and social circumstances. There can never be a single formula for success. However, across the 48 states of sub-Saharan Africa, there are three priority areas which we must note. Number one, we should look at the issues regarding infrastructural development needs and how to accelerate this. African countries will have to build an industrial base, draw much needed investment, and compete in the global economy. To do so, businesses and citizens will need to have access to reliable, affordable electricity and a communication and transportation infrastructure that allows efficient and cost-effective movement of goods, labor, and services. Linkages of African markets to one another and the global economy are crucial now, more than ever before. Number two, our economies in Africa need integration. Most African economies are too small to diversify and develop a competitive manufacturing base without expanding trade links to regional markets and deepening integration. As significant, potentially transformative investors consider basing operations in Africa, they will need relatively easy, efficient access to more extensive regional markets, supply chains, and labor pools if their investments are to be economically viable. And thirdly, Africa's workforce must be capable. Here we come to the issue of education. Education is crucial for African economies to progress and lay the foundation for more sophisticated and competitive manufacturing and services capacity. African governments will need to invest adequately in educating their youngest citizens to have competent and capable participants in their future workforce. Now I come to the second part of my lecture, which is talking about the capacities for planning Africa, because that is very crucial. Our major failure in Africa has been the lack of planning. Capacity development is a broad notion which is also a chain process at the level of individuals, organizations, and societies. Developing capacity is also about the many ways of sustaining capabilities like technical cooperation, working with non-state actors, promoting multi-stakeholders processes, and knowledge sharing. Africa has good development plans at continental, sub-regional, and national levels, but efforts to implement these plans are being stumbled by severe capacity deficits, often in the form of shortage of critical skills, deficiencies in leadership, inhibiting mindsets, and weak institutions. The continent's skills shortage is acute in critical areas such as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, what we call STEM, as well as in agriculture. Many initiatives are currently being undertaken to create and enhance capacity at varying levels. These include plans and programs from governments, intergovernmental, and non-governmental organizations to address capacity problems in many of Africa's lopsided development enterprises. We know that the administrative capabilities of almost all continents of Sub-Saharan Africa were weak at the time of independence in the 1960s, with weak human, institutional, and organizational capacities. Over time, such abilities further weakened with a multiplicity of policies that included the implementation of policy agendas of the general community during the 1980s and the 1990s. Also, many African governments lacked the foresight to express concern about the short-term development imperatives of their respective countries, sub-regions and the region as a whole in the 2000s. Now, what about development planning in Africa? Development planning has a long and complex history in Africa, with the continent's development course witnessing different methods and approaches from the 1960s, when many sub-Saharan countries attained nationhood. Development planning in Africa started in the early 1960s with a centralized type of planning, spanning from a 3 to 5 year planning phase. There were at least 32 African countries that produced a national development plan during the 1960s. The first generation of development plans continued to the 1980s. These plans promoted state-engineered economies with resources allocated by governments. It was notably the time of state-owned enterprises operating in most of the productive sectors. Still, Africa's development plans of the 1960s met with limited success. There were many reasons for this. In the first place, plan documents had shortcomings. Also, countries failed to implement these plans because of ambitiously formulated targets. Moreover, there were institutional and bureaucratic weaknesses resulting in extreme shocks and other political factors. Extensive neglect of homegrown planning under neoliberal structural adjustment programs known as SAPs marked the second phase in the evolution of planning in Africa. These SAPs emerged in the 1980s to 1990s with the support of the Bretton Woods institution, the IMF and the World Bank. The primary goal of SAPs was to decrease the role of the state in production and service delivery. SAPs emphasize macroeconomic stability, the downsizing of public sector institutions, privatization, and cutting government spending and budget deficits. SAPs resulted in grave consequences for each country affected by massive social costs. The downsizing of the public sector institutions and massive privatizations led to net job losses. The budget restrictions that went with SAPs compromised social service delivery and human capital development. Most importantly, SAPs failed to generate the expected growth outcomes, as the annual economic growth for Africa over the 1990s averaged only 2.1%. What this proved to us all was that even the best written development plans cannot succeed without an enabling domestic and external environment, backed up by the institutional capacities and resources for implementation. The challenges that African countries have experienced in the execution of their development plans vary by state and period, but in general, the discontinuities and distractions in plan implementation, coupled with the dysfunctional institutional architectures and weak institutional capacities, have played a critical role in undermining the success of development plans in Africa. Also, the tenuous links between resource allocation and development priorities, with overdependence on external resources and weak relationships between national and subnational planning and implementation processes, have also contributed grossly in sabotaging development plans on the continent. Discontinuities and distractions prompted by conflicts, constitutional and unconstitutional regime changes have often derailed the implementation of development plans in Africa. An excess of externally imposed agendas and conditions that have consistently closed or narrowed down the policy-making space made matters worse. Undemocratic regime changes have been driven by conflict and coup d'etats. Africa has seen at least 200 successful and failed coups since the 1960s. Institutional arrangements for development planning in Africa have generally been dysfunctional, resulting in weak coordination between central planning bureaus, ministries of finance and other line ministries, and a failure to align resources with national priorities. Strong coordination between central planning agencies and ministries of finance is a prerequisite for aligning financial resources with national development priorities. Disproportionate power relations between central planning bodies and ministries of finance have unfortunately weakened planning agencies' capacity to fulfill their role in coordinating the planning process and ensuring the alignment of the programs and projects of implementing agencies with the priorities of national development plans. Experience in African countries suggests that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the role of the Central Planning Agency. But to the extent that the Finance Ministry remains the super ministry, planning will continue to be subservient to finance. African countries need a credible mechanism that assigns equal importance to finance and planning in the governmental hierarchy. Explicit support from the highest level of government that will be necessary in such a case, as in Malaysia, as we see that most of it is centered around the Prime Minister's office, or by placing control of budgeted expenditure in the hands of the Central Planning Agency. The latter option requires excellent coordination to ensure that due consideration of the recurrent cost implications of all capital account expenditures. Weak capacities in the use of planning tools have also contributed to implementation setbacks. For effective planning to take place, there must be cooperation between national and subnational institutions and actors in the implementation process. Subnational participation enhances comprehensive planning and facilitates continuity in the planning process. The implementation of development plans in Africa has, however, suffered from challenges in synergizing national and subnational systems. Where there has been a shift towards more decentralized approaches to implementation, national and subnational institutions have often not been adequately integrated into development programs. There are also other challenges, such as the human capacity challenges. See, there are two dimensions that we can identify with the human capacity challenge of Africa. First, there is a shortage of jobs to satisfy the demands of an increasingly ambitious and expectant generation of young people. Much of this is due to the structural underdevelopment of African economies, which continue to rely on primary commodities production and export and capital-intensive extractive industries. While the official unemployment rate was 8.3% in 2012, now estimated at 12%, 70% of the African workforce was classified by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa as being in vulnerable employment. Without accelerated growth, economic diversification, and expansion of more labor-intensive sectors such as agribusiness and manufacturing, this problem will not be resolved quickly as young population continues to grow. Poor education could leave a generation of young school and college leavers without the skills required for them to compete in an increasingly competitive global digital marketplace. At the same time, there is a shortage of suitably qualified workers to fill the limited number of skilled jobs available, stemming in large part from long-standing deficits in primary and secondary education systems in the majority of African countries, which are failing to turn out sufficient numbers of suitably qualified graduates. Africa lags badly behind the rest of the world in school attendance and educational performance. School enrollment has risen dramatically in the last 20 years, but education deficit remains large compared with other parts of the world. In 2011, 22% of Africa's primary school age children were out of school, compared with 11% in Arab states and 7% in South and West Asia, and 5% in Latin America and the Caribbean. This according to UNESCO Institute of Statistics figures published in January 2014. Africa has the lowest level of secondary school attendance as well, with 34% enrollment compared with 65% in Arab states and 90% in Latin America, according to UNESCO's Global Monitoring Report of 2010. Some 7% of college-age youths are enrolled in a university in Africa compared to 30% in the rest of the world. Now, what are the remedies to these challenges? Due to experiences in planning, policymakers and decision makers learned considerably with better information about the need to develop a more comprehensive agenda for public sector reforms. They were also able to look into the importance of good institutions in the development process, especially in the new context of globalization. In the early 2000s, social adjustment programs, SAPs, were replaced by poverty reduction strategies, PRSPs, which aimed at reversing the adverse effects of a decade of structural adjustment on welfare and social conditions. PRSPs emphasize strongly on reducing poverty as a condition for debt relief. Several African countries undertook PRSPs for at least 2 generations with the aim of ensuring their eligibility for debt relief. However, many lacked credibility as the whole process was again externally driven, even when at the back of minds there was always the notion of ownership and consultation to strengthen PRSPs. Furthermore, PRSPs tended to place unbalanced emphasis on the social sector at the expense of the productive industry, thereby raising questions about the sustainability of the poverty reduction agenda. They have also recently developed a keen interest in and a return to more comprehensive development plans that go way beyond PRSPs, which may be seen as short-sighted. Indeed, several African countries have adopted long-term development plan visions and planning frameworks with far more aggressive growth and social development objectives. There is also the National Development Strategies, known as the NDS, which have now gone beyond the narrow objective of poverty reduction to encompass goals such as accelerated growth, employment creation, structural transformation, and sustainable development. Contrary to what we witnessed in the 1960s, these plans engage a combination of state and market-based approaches. They also appreciate the critical role of both the public and the private sector in the development process. Many African countries have developed what we call long-term visions to guide their steps towards these ambitious objectives. These long-term visions want to ensure that African actors assume stronger ownership as well as a more consultative and participatory process that will involve a broad spectrum of stakeholders. These will include civil society, the private sector, varying decentralized constituencies, and development partners. These more extensive national development plans often take into consideration various global and continental development goals and frameworks, such as NEPA, that is the New Partnership for Africa's Development, under the auspices of the African Union. Now we come to the issue of monitoring national development plans, where we have a big problem. Monitoring and evaluation systems in Africa have improved over time, but can still be considered immature and evolving. Donor reporting requirements and conditions have generally often driven monitoring and evaluation activities on the continent. Most African countries are yet to fully own and appreciate the importance and relevance of monitoring and evaluation of evidence-based policy making. The findings of monitoring and evaluation reports are consequently not fully exploited to inform and improve policy making and budget allocations. But beyond internalizing the culture of monitoring and evaluation, monitoring systems in Africa tend to be fragmented, suffering from weak institutional capacities and lacking robust statistical methods to provide the data necessary for control. There is also a disproportionate focus on expenditure tracking and activity-level monitoring as opposed to results-based monitoring. Furthermore, national and subnational monitoring systems are often not integrated, which often omits essential information about local level performance in plan implementation. In most cases, institutional mechanisms exist only in theory, with a lack of commitment and capacities hampering them. Now we come to the real issues now of today. How do we plan for Africa's transformation agenda? We have the African Union, that has now come up with the Agenda 2063. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are universal, which are global. And then within the African Union also, we have what we call the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, CESA, 2016 to 2025. So we have a transformation agenda, which we are pursuing under the auspices of the African Union's vision of an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa, driven by its citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. Therefore, success will be elusive unless we purposefully harness the potential of the continent's young people and take into account all the planning-related issues raised in this keynote speech. African leaders have given credibility to this view by identifying youth development and science, technology and innovation as the main pillars of Agenda 2063. I have already talked about how the African continent is today engulfed in what we now call the youth bulge, as the demographics on the continent change with many obvious challenges. I have also intimated that these challenges surface more in the education systems, where the question of relevance is increasingly becoming the subject of much conversation. As Africa's widespread youth unemployment threatens to undermine social and political stability, with many young people becoming particularly vulnerable to radicalization. The question now is, how are we as Africans going to do better by reassuring the importance of planning and embarking on a different path to recreate and enhance existing capacity for efficient development through our education systems in this demographic transition? Agenda 2063 is the African Union's 50-year vision and action plan for the Africa that Africans want. Agenda 2063 is calling for action by all segments of society to work together and build a prosperous and united Africa based on shared values and a common destiny. It is a strategic framework for the socio-economic transformation of the continent over the next 50 years. It builds on and seeks to accelerate the implementation of past and existing continental initiatives for growth and sustainable development. Education remains a top priority for Africa and is now contributing tremendously to the strengthening of capacities in various disciplines. It plays a pivotal role in enabling the continent to achieve the aspirations it laid down in its people-centered and long-term transformative change. Agenda 2063, through the development of competent and productive human resources. The Global 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, put strong emphasis to ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. Education is considered important enough to warrant a standalone goal among the SDGs. In this respect, UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, has gone further to elaborate on the 2030 education agenda, emphasizing quality education where no one will be left behind, as well as ensuring employable skills for the youth and ensuring sustainable living. There is also the African Union's Continental Education Strategy for Africa 2016 to 2025, also known as CESA 16 to 25. It is through a strong political will and motivation that CESA 16 to 25 is premised to lift large section of Africa's population out of poverty, reduce inequalities, gender disparity, and empower the African citizenry to be innovative, also address continental challenges and promote global competitiveness. CESA 16 to 25 creates a conducive learning environment at all levels, including informal and non-formal settings, while in the process revitalizes education systems and ensures quality and relevance. It further promotes access to education by reaching large numbers of students and professionals and taking advantage of non-conventional methods such as the use of technologies and ICTs. Strategic partnerships are key to the implementation of CESA. The African Union has set up a committee of champions of heads of states and government on education, science and technology. The African Union has also established the Pan-African University, which has set up its e-university. The Union is also expanding technical and vocational education and training, known as TVET, opportunities at both secondary and tertiary levels, and also institutionalize the social school feeding programs, which the African Union celebrates on every 1st of March. Such is Africa's journey towards 2030 and beyond to 2063 for the Africa that we want. Now we come to the question of partnership and strategic partnerships, and that's important that I'm here for that. Through these strategic partnerships, those responsible for implementation of CESA are assigned to reorient Africa's education and training system to meet the knowledge, competencies, skills, innovation, and creativity required to nurture African core values and promote sustainable development at national, sub-regional, and continental levels. The goal of CESA 1625 lies on the creation of a new context favorable to the full inclusion of education among the priorities of the AU, the African Union, the RECs, the regional economic communities, and member states of the African Union. To this end, the African Union will examine and address the current communication gaps. This will include looking into the actual differences between ratifications, domestication, and implementation of the various treaties on education, as well as the insufficient commitment on the part of governments to fully implement policies and plans in pursuit of international targets like the SDG, the Agenda 2063 and CESA. The African Union will work with traditional partners and also emphasize on South-South cooperation for the implementation of the agendas. The African Union will also ensure political leadership in the orientation and agenda setting of the activities of CESA, emphasizing on communicating the principles of the continental strategy well to its member states and at the international level. The African Union will also ensure the choice of priorities in investment and action, the formulation and adoption of the implementation of programs and projects, the mobilization and the distribution of resources, and the monitoring and validation of results. But we have a lot of challenges, new challenges. These constitute ensuring that we have credible consultation processes. We must also prioritize our funding and keep it in line with our continental development aspirations. Donor coordination is another area that needs greater attention, as Africans can no longer leave their fate to be decided by external donors. Finally, we must strengthen the capacities at all levels and ensure proper implementation of projects and programs, and develop active monitoring and evaluation systems that feed back into the policy-making process. Planning experiences in many African countries point to some overarching and specific guidelines for development partners and policymakers. We may bear the following issues in mind as we attempt to ensure that planning and implementation take place at the country level. Number one, development planning is vital for developing countries because the task of addressing market failure should not go to the invisible hand of the market. Number two, there is no substitute for an active and committed leadership to guide development planning in Africa. Such administration also must act to ensure inclusiveness and to involve all stakeholders groups. Moreover, commitment and ownership are of critical importance for good leadership. Number three, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to development planning. Strategies that work for one country may not necessarily work for another. Furthermore, for any given country, procedures that work at one point in time may not be appropriate at another point in time. Number four, stability is critical for successful planning. Discontinuities, including those caused by regime changes and changes of government, have contributed to implementation failures in Africa. Number five, political commitment is crucial for nurturing a healthy central planning establishment. The primary stages of the planning process call for this, as the effectiveness of central planning body will depend on the political commitment to nurture and sustain it. Number six, a country can rely on aid while owning and leading its development process by constructing a sound development plan with a clear set of priorities and assigning donors to specific actors of development. The country must also have a firm commitment to the defined development goals. The specific planning guidelines fall into the following three categories again: comprehensive planning, effective planning, and corrective planning. When we're talking about comprehensive planning, we are talking about establishing traditional mechanisms for stakeholder engagement that will promote and sustain inclusiveness. We are also talking about large private companies that should be given an essential role during consultations to design a development plan, as private sector associations do not always represent the full range of opinions within the sector. We are also talking about examining a development agenda that undermines the integrity of the consultation process. We're also looking at restricting the scope of consultation on the macroeconomic framework, which could be counterproductive and undermine ownership. When we're talking about effective planning, we're looking at central planning agencies that must be assigned equal importance to finance ministries to ensure the effective coordination and alignment of resources with development policies. We also want to look at how we can design a development plan. The central government should provide broad evidence and should then leave it to the lower levels of government to develop detailed strategies for implementation. Also, decentralized approaches to planning promotes grassroots participation and enhances continuity in plan implementation. And under corrective planning, monitoring and evaluation, we can say that the coordination of a decentralized monitoring and evaluation system is a necessary precondition for satisfactory achievement in plan implementation. Integrated monitoring and evaluation systems are a key to the avoidance of fragmented planning implementation. Monitoring and evaluation system must orientate to both domestic stakeholders and development partners. And there are more ways we could improve planning. In short, we need more action to develop planning frameworks in Africa to translate development planning aspirations and priorities into concrete results. We need to suggest the following. 1. Support the strengthening of national capacity to design, implement, and monitor useful planning frameworks. 2. We still have data challenges. The effectiveness of national planning systems hinges mostly on the availability and quality of data. Reliable data are essential to inform the setting of priorities and to facilitate the tracking of performance. Another vital aspect is coordination. I've already mentioned that. Coordination is essential because ministries of finance and the ministries or entities in charge of development planning, among others. Such coordination will ensure better linkages in the planning cycles to those of the budget and hence provide effective implementation of the National Development Plan. We can also leverage our development planning capacities by developing mechanisms for peer learning and experience sharing. A network of development planners that include an electronic platform that will serve as a repository of literature, current research related to development planning is necessary. This platform will also include forums for discussion and exchange of ideas and experiences related to all aspects of the plan. Africa's rough experience with development planning in the past is seeding ground to a more positive outlook for the future. Indeed, there are some excellent examples of success stories among African countries, which in the recent past have gone from low-income countries to middle-income countries. And these include countries like Cape Verde, Ghana, Zambia, and Botswana. Also, some African countries such as Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Uganda have adopted long-term development visions and planning frameworks with far more aggressive growth and social development objectives, with further detailed policies and strategies than what we typically use in PRSPs. And the final part, or second to last part, is about how do we want to be successful? Number one, we need to encourage training collaborations. Large investors are looking strategically at Africa, have a strong incentive in building up the skilled sets of potential employees to maximize commercial efficiency. And some companies are investing in collaborative partnerships with governments and educational institutions. More governments and private companies are looking to collaborate to expand training opportunities for mid-career officials and personnel in technical areas such as procurement, management, and planning. Number two, we need to build regional labor pools in Africa. A core element of regional integration and economic competitiveness is the ability of labor to move smoothly across borders. Visa requirements for intra-African migration are among the most restrictive in the world. Like international companies that are looking at long-term engagement in Africa are willing to make considerable investment in local workforce development. But for newer players in sectors that are less commercially certain, the substantial upfront investment in training and the constraints on hiring top-line personnel may serve as a deterrent. Visa restrictions and local content regulations limit opportunities to draw on a larger talent pool, but also cost national economies in long-term competitiveness. Intra-regional labor mobility and local hire requirements are often politically charged issues, as policymakers seek to protect domestic employment opportunities. But restricting cross-border movement may also limit the entry of regional entrepreneurs and investors who can create jobs, bring expertise and know-how, and help develop new industries. Ultimately, the onus remains on African governments to be strategic and balanced in setting the terms of their relationship with international companies and investors. And these decisions must reside on sound analysis and understanding of such short and long-term consequences. We must reach out to the diaspora also. The African diaspora offers a significant pool of talent and technical expertise that can be harnessed to build capacity on the continent. As Africa's fortunes continue to rise, many in the diaspora are looking at investment and employment opportunities in their countries of origin, with global firms benefiting. Many in the African diaspora have technical and managerial skills their home countries lack, and can further support economic growth through their knowledge of foreign private sectors. Many programs shape around short-term stints in the state of origin. For example, the Ethiopian North American Health Professionals Association, which works to support healthcare in Ethiopia through biennial missions and transfer of knowledge, skills, and state-of-the-art technology. We should also invest in the workforce of the future. Africa is not in reality short of trained, talented individuals with entrepreneurial skills and business know-how, but investors often cite the lack of managerial and leadership skills, as well as the shortage of STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics among the African workforce. A central priority, if African governments are to lay the ground for long-term sustained growth and competitiveness, must be to improve the accessibility and quality of education at primary and secondary levels. Learning availability with quality is a fundamental requirement to nurture and build a pool of graduates with the practical skills, capacity to adapt to new industries, and a grounding in national development priorities. With increasing constraints on public funding and foreign development assistance, expanding both the reach and quality of the educational systems will be a significant challenge and a fiscal burden. But the longer-term cost of failed education system should prompt greater urgency in finding efficiencies, strengthening quality assurance and oversight, and looking to new technologies and partnerships to expand educational opportunities. Several new initiatives are underway to boost tertiary education levels in Africa at the regional level. I've already mentioned the Pan-African University. This university was launched by the African Union in 2011, creating centers of excellence in regional hub universities open to high-performing students from across Africa in fields like science, technology, energy, and high sciences. The World Bank has also taken a similar regional approach, working to strengthen elite higher education institutions in West and Central Africa to concentrate more on training and applied research in areas such as water, infrastructure, hospitality, industries, and information and communication technology, the sectors of growth and opportunity in the coming decades. And finally, what is the path ahead? African governments have a window in which to prepare the ground for long-term growth and maximize current investment and finance opportunities, as well as make the upfront investments that will drive economic transformation. Our governments in Africa, the private sector, and civil society all have a role to play. The government must help push the process through a clearly articulated long-term vision. Such a cause must constitute a business environment that promotes economic competitiveness, regulatory rules, and enforcement capacities that protect citizens and the environment. Government must also have a robust investment in the well-being and education of their citizens. Private investors too should look to the long term if they want to accelerate and ultimately benefit from the great opportunities on the horizon. Universities, think tanks, and advocacy groups can play a crucial role in providing strategic analysis and vision, informing public debate, and highlighting emerging models of progress and success. And African citizens themselves can build constituencies for reform and oversight that ensure that benefits and opportunity get equitable distribution and which hold both government and private sector to account. Africa is at an exciting stage in its development journey, and the expectations are that the continent will soon become a new type of global growth. Africa must nevertheless continue to plan its development trajectory and also increase its policy space. The continent's leaders must make prudent decisions about the appropriate strategies, and the continent will need to attain economic growth and structural transformation. As we always say in our circles, failing to plan means planning to fail. I thank you very much.